I gotta tell you, you're a brave man when your wife sits there at the downtown by herself before you show up for lunch.
Yeah. Surprised somebody hasn't swept her off her feet yet.
I think that hasn't happened, huh? Well, I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. I told her I'd keep my mouth shut.
Yeah. Oh, seems like every time I try to do a lunch date with her, every time, I'm walking out the door and I get a phone call.
You're taking a chance. You're a long way out over your skis with her already, so I don't think I'd take any chances if I were you.
Oh. Yeah, there's just. She's in the middle of her master's class right now. She comes home just sobbing yesterday. Honey, what's wrong? I forgot to paste one of the paragraphs that I had written into my final draft of my paper. I got an 87 on my paper. It's the lowest grade she's ever gotten in her life, ever. She's got a 97.8 in the class, even with that low grade. But she's just, oh my gosh, she's just absolutely beside herself right now. She got an 87 on one paper. I looked at her and it's like, man, there are some classes I was hoping for an 87.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You could dream of an
Yeah,
87.
I could only wish.
Oh, if I get a B in this class, man, that is gonna be the berry spot. Here she is, just devastated. She got an 87. So, but she sat down and did the math, and if she takes the end of course survey, that's worth 10 bonus points.
There you go.
So as long as she gets a 95 or better on everything else in the next 2 weeks and takes the survey, she'll still wind up with a 99 in the class. So.
I want to know how many potential employers even look at college grades. They want to know, did you graduate?
Well, when I see her downtown next time, I'm gonna say, I understand she's struggling with this class. Your husband said you were really having trouble with this class. You have to take it over?
You know what I'm running on to?
What's that?
All the notices that classmates that I had fun with in school are dying off like flies,
Yeah.
you know? All the smartest ones that were in my pharmacy class are all gone. They're all gone. I'm thinking, what the hell did I do
What
right?
do you think, borrowed time, Gene?
I don't know.
You living on borrowed time?
I know
I must be on
We gotta get these
borrowed
power
time.
lines going, don't we?
Well, we'll go ahead and get the meeting started, and Dan will just work his way in when we get here.
Okay.
I'm gonna go ahead and call the February meeting of the Board of Aviation Commissioners of the City of Warsaw to order. You all should have received your packets electronically or in physical form. First thing on the agenda is approval of the minutes for the January 8th meeting.
I make a motion to accept the minutes as presented.
Second.
All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed say nay. Motion carried. Next. Nick, I see claims,
Yeah,
they're not a long list.
pretty short and sweet.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Anything in particular to bring to our attention?
Looking to see if there's anything major out of the ordinary.
Everything seems pretty familiar to me.
Yeah, unless you have specific questions or comments. I would like to point out that NIPSCO bill of 242412 is about a third of what it used to be to heat the terminal building and the shop. Since we've insulated the shop building and installed the new high-efficiency furnaces, and you remember the curtain or the blinds that we put into the terminal? We leave those shut at night, and those they have the same insulating value as 3 inches of brick. And that has drastically cut our heating bills for those 2 buildings. And we've actually already paid off all of the money that we invested in that. And from here forward, everything is just money in the bank that we are saving. So
Wow, that's pretty
it was a
good.
it was a great investment.
It is really great.
Well, good for you for thinking of it.
Yep.
I'd like to take credit for it, but I can't. It'd be his idea. We just approved it.
Right.
The only other one is the InGuard That is for our annual public official bond for the fuel trust fund account
Okay,
for $375.
okay. So we would need a motion to approve all the claims as presented and specifically the Ascent Aviation charge and the in-guard bond.
Correct.
So moved.
And second,
We moved to second. Any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. Motion carried. Now, what did I have here? Let me get back to where I was. Okay, now we don't have Ken. Do you want to, but you want to give an engineer's report kind of and
Yep.
discuss what he's been, okay, well,
If-
go ahead. Floor is yours.
Well, if we're gonna do that, I'm gonna have to relocate quickly, so excuse me a second. Linda, would you grab the lights?
Oh, this is a multimedia presentation.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Nothing but the best.
Stay awake, Gene.
Oop, can't see the sign now.
Yeah, hit the other one, Linda, see if that works.
There you go, Gene.
See if I can get this going. Okay. So this is just, I'm giving this report on behalf of Ken Ross and myself both. This morning, we had a really good meeting / conference call with the FAA. The reason that Ken is not here today is because he is actually in Chicago and Aurora, and he was up there for this for this meeting this morning. I did not go because we had the board meeting tonight, and I didn't want to get stuck up there because of the weather that we had today. And I was able to call in and participate in that sense, so. We did receive comments on our draft ALP, the airport layout plan, finally, on January 12th, we submitted those, January 12th of 2018. We received written responses from Gary Wilson, who is part of the FAA Planning Office, on January 23rd of 2019. On the 29th, the FAA requested that we meet with them on February 7th to provide a status of our work regarding the written comments and provide them with answers on how we were proposing to address certain concerns that they had. So that's just, we submitted everything in January of 2018. They finally got back to us January 23rd of 2019, and they gave us a week to respond to 62 comments that they had and wanted all of those responses back within that week. Because of the extreme cold that we saw, the FAA offices were actually closed for 2 days, and with the government shutdown, that also pushed the meeting back a little bit, so we rescheduled that meeting for this morning. And that also worked out for Ken because he had other meetings with the FAA, with other airports today as well. NGC, Ken and his group went over the airport layout plan comments with Gary Wilson on February 4th. That was a really good conference call. Gary Wilson requested that we provide a confirmation on some different geometries on the runway ends. I will go into that in a little bit more detail here in just a second. And then the other big request that the FAA had was that they needed basically a reassurance letter from AEP, the power line company, American Electric Power, that once they lower those power lines, the miseducation that we have right now is there's two main projects. Obviously, the road is a separate project and the power lines are a separate project, but we are trying to regain 900 feet of displaced threshold that we currently have at the airport. That is our number one priority right now, is to gain that runway back. In the future, 4, 5, 6 years down the road, if the justification is there and we need to lengthen the runway to 7,000 feet, and I believe, and the FAA believes that that justification is there, the FAA wants to be assured that we won't have to relower those power lines a second time, so that when we lower them now, even if we do wind up extending that runway to 7,000 feet in the future, we won't have to redo all of that work again. We did receive that letter from AEP. not exactly what they wanted, but the FAA accepted it. They said there's a couple tweaks that they want, but what we have right now is definitely good enough. The part that made me frustrated that I wanted to share with you guys, our program manager, Delora Small, sent out an email at 6:40 last night after this meeting had been scheduled for 2 weeks and canceled. She could not attend the meeting this morning. This is the 4th meeting that she has not been able to attend since she has been our program manager. So that just makes me frustrated because I don't feel like, it makes me feel like we're not a very high priority for her. Her boss also was unable to attend because he had previously scheduled training. So we actually got lucky. The ADO manager, Deb Bartel, stood in replacement for the two of them, and she was able to give us a much higher level of understanding of what we were doing with some of these programs. Let me get back to my notes here. One thing that AEP said in their email to the FAA is they wanted to reserve the need to review cost estimates. Part of that is due to the recent steel tariffs that have gone into place, and that could potentially cause the project to change in price up or down one way. They do not know how that will affect us yet, but they wanted that in writing with the FAA that the cost estimate we have right now is good for now. But if the price of steel changes because of the tariffs that are currently in place, they may need to adjust that pricing accordingly. The FAA is still working on power lines and their airspace, or the air spacing of the power lines, and that is not complete because the air spacing portion of the FAA was closed during the government shutdown, so they were not able to complete that. They are hoping to have that to us in the next couple weeks, and Gary Wilson said that he would double check on that and email me a better estimate of when those plans will be done and give us a better ETA here in the next couple days. And then we will be going into basically the meat of what we talked about today. Oh, let me turn on my pointer here so I can point. So the main headache that we are having with the FAA right now is the 2 runway ends. Let me get to my notes so I make sure I tell you the right things. The biggest, and if you can't see or need further detail, just shout at me. The biggest things that they are hesitating on right now is the intersection between the north-south runway and the east-west runway, as well as the east-west runway and where the road mitigation project is going to take place. So those are the 2 areas that we're going to be looking at very much up close here in the next couple slides. This is short term. Right now, this diagram shows exactly what we as an airport are trying to fix right now. Currently, that is the threshold for the north-south runway, and that is the threshold for our east-west runway. That does not fall into today's standards for the FAA. And so what Ken and I have proposed and what we are pushing for is to move that threshold up roughly to where the 3.6 is, and I'll show that here in a moment, so that threshold is outside of the runway safety area. That is the red box here. And by moving that threshold to that line, we can make this portion of the runway a displaced threshold like we have over on the east end of runway 927. That leaves the pavement there, and it allows us to use that runway for takeoff and for those numbers. We can't use that part of the runway for landing, but the takeoff is on that runway is the more critical spot. Most of our jets do not use that for landing, but there are times of the year, specifically in the winter when wind is really strong out of the north, that we do have jets use that for takeoff specifically to the north. So that, by moving that threshold up would fix a lot of that. And then I'll get into what we will do in the long term here. On the east end of the airport, this is 100 East here, and then here's the displaced threshold. Our number one concern right now is to get rid of this displaced threshold and get rid of, this is where the declared distance takes us to, and make that actual usable runway for our pilots. Now, this is assuming the power lines have already been lowered and that project is complete. So these slides here are talking about mitigation of the roadway project. Short term, within the next few years, what we would like to do, like I said, is move that threshold north and then make that displaced threshold. And then this chart doesn't show that, but this section of pavement right here will actually need to come out. The FAA does not allow a crossover inside of that runway safety area. That's one of the areas we're going to have to remove. And then what we would like to do is put this green section here of the road 100 East, we are proposing that be tunneled. And if that road is tunneled and the power lines are removed, that would allow us to recover all of our runway safety, or it would allow us to recover our entire displaced threshold, and it would also allow us to get rid of our declared distances, which would give our jets the full 6,001 feet for landing on that runway. I know we've gone over a lot of this before, but I just want to make sure that we're really going in depth here in what we talked about today.
Is that fence back far enough?
It is.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then once the tunnel has happened and everything else, I'll go back there, we may need to move that fence depending on how the tunneling is. The fence is not the issue, it's the actual roadway. So different classes of roads have different, there are guidelines as to how tall vehicles typically are on those roads. And we have to engineer all of our approaches into the airport based on those numbers. On the north end of our airport up here, right there is where our threshold currently is, and we're going to actually have to move it south about 4 feet because the classification of 350 North has changed since that runway was put in 1979. And we need to move that threshold south because a different type of truck could potentially drive on 350 North. The pavement stays the same, it's just how we paint it when we redo that runway. The study that we just finished, that $180,000 that we just did with this year's, or I should say last year's grant money. But that's the kind of geometry that the FAA is looking at, making sure everything is to standard.
Now, I have a question about that 350 North. Really what you're saying is that the way that these things are categorized by either NDOT or the FAA changes that road. It's not as if all of a sudden different kind of trucks can operate on that road that didn't used to be able to operate on.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. And they take in, there's a whole calculation, and I do not want to sit here and profess that I know how they come up with those numbers or how they come up with that data. But we as an airport take that data and interpolate it into our engineering for those runway ends. And so, I mean, like I said, we're talking about 4 feet difference because it all comes with the gradient off the end of the runway. As you're taking off or landing, are you clearing the traffic that is potentially on those roads?
Will that proposed displacement of threshold at the north end of that runway change all actual operations on that
No.
runway in your opinion?
No.
Okay.
That runway, right now, the biggest issue is the runway right there where that crossover is, right down there to where the middle of the runway there, that is the only part of that runway that is currently classified as runway. So by reclassifying the two ends, so the north end up here and then down here, the same way as this displaced threshold on the east side, we're actually theoretically gaining 400 to 600 feet on either end of the runway that we've never had for takeoff. We won't have that for landing still, but like I said, the takeoff is the main priority.
And for takeoff, we
Correct.
use it for landing.
Correct.
Okay.
And the small aircraft, the single engine pistons, that will not affect their operations at all. The biggest thing for us is to maintain that runway length as a viable crossover or a crosswind runway for the light jets. The Beach jets, the King Airs, the small turboprops that need that extra runway for when we do have those strong winds out of the north. A heavy Gulfstream that's coming in at 65, 70,000 pounds, they can have they don't like it, but they can have a 20 or 25 mile an hour north to south crosswind and still land on the east-west runway without breaking too much sweat. But a light jet that might only weigh 6,000 pounds definitely needs that crosswind runway because it would get blown off the center line. They don't have the same kind of weight that the larger jets have. So just if the power lines are taken care of, if we could tunnel the road, and that is the preferred option for the airport, the tunnel would be inside of those green areas right there. And we would basically depress the road and then build walls up on either side, put fill dirt over the top, and seed it until we would decide, hey, we need to lengthen the runway in the future. Ultimately, best case scenario, if everything worked out, what the standards that we are engineering that runway to right now is to ultimately, I should say potentially, extend the runway 500 feet to the west. The FAA has, they really like having the runways actually intersect. So on the west end of the runway, 1836 and 927 would actually have a physical cross. The only issue we're working through right now is they do not like taxiways to cross a runway to come down and then take off on that runway. So we're working through that geometry right now. We should have that done in the next week or two. And then on the east end of the airport, this is 100 East here. Once we get to it, we can potentially, everything that we are doing now will extend that runway 1,000 feet to the east once the power lines are lowered and then the roadway is tunneled. And then that shows into the field about how far that 1,000 feet is going to go. And then the red area here is that is the runway safety area. And then the green area is the runway object-free area. So with all of that, we are waiting on comments. The FAA did tell us this morning they will have responses to our comments to them within the next week or two. That is the next step that we are waiting on right now. And even if the FAA were to deny this portion right here, that runway will stay exactly where it is, and we just won't have that 500 feet of displaced threshold, and ultimately the runway would still be the 7,000 feet. But again, we're talking 5 to 7 years down the road before we would be really looking at that and studying that then, because who knows what's going to happen between now and then. We may need to engineer that runway wider. There's lots of things that we need to study and make sure we have exact, but we do need to recoup that 1,000-foot displaced threshold right now. As of right now, there were no other, we went through all of this. We had a very good conversation about everything. There were no other concerns that were expressed by the FAA, myself, NGC. So we are, again, the next week or two, we should receive responses back from the FAA about these specific things right here. And the next big thing for us is to really get on our senators, our representatives, and local businesses to write the FAA, to write the US DOT, to really push the power lines for supplemental funding. The FAA actually is not in control of those supplemental funds. That is a DOT controlled program. And so getting senator support, representative support is going to be our biggest push and potential, our biggest way that we could potentially see those funds. And the reason we really want those supplemental funds is that is a 100% grant. The airport would not have to pay any matching funds towards that. And so if we could get even just the power lines done underneath that program itself, we could potentially try to push all of our other projects. And I'll go back to that slide real quick. This is our capital improvement program for the next 5 years, 2019 through 2024. And if the power lines were to get taken care of with the supplemental funds, we could potentially apply for discretionary funds from the FAA to try and repave and rehab the north-south runway in the 2019 fiscal year. That's a long shot. That would be asking for a lot from the FAA in 1 year, but it is something that is the main reason we needed to get that engineering project done in 2018 so that runway is designed and ready to go. So if we get the go-ahead and the nod to shovel ready, here we go.
Two questions based on what you just said. First of all, we never have in the history of this airport asked for any kind of comparable chunk of money at one time like that.
Correct.
Okay, so that's just, so everybody knows that, this is, maybe becomes our turn. Second of all, beyond senators, representatives, did you say you thought it might be helpful to have some directed letters from business leaders here in the community?
Specifically that use the airport. And we're already reaching out to those department heads, to those flight departments, to see if they would be interested in sending us letters of support stating, we need these programs done because this is the type of operation that we are doing out of Warsaw.
Okay, I have a couple ideas in that area as well.
Okay.
So check in with me tomorrow or Thursday.
Can do. Any other questions? Do you have any questions? Linda? She's the boss anyway.
Okay.
All right. Well, that's all I have on our conference call with the FAA. Like I said, I think it went really, really well this morning. It was a meeting that was long overdue, and it was very, very productive in my opinion.
Well, thank you for your efforts. Make sure to pass on to Ken the board's appreciation for stepping things up. So
Yep.
we can keep things moving as quickly as possible, and hopefully there will not be another shutdown. The first presidential shutdown is probably enough, and we don't need to have that again.
Yeah. Okay.
And I only say that because he takes responsibility for it. So.
Other than that, that was the engineer's report. And so I guess we're back to the normal meeting.
Okay. Now, any other questions about that?
Nope. Nope.
Okay. Manager's report.
Well, if we look at fuel usage for the month, you can see that we were down actually just a little bit from where we were last year, roughly 5,000 gallons. And even with that, because of that new price structure, you can see that we were actually up in revenue, not quite, but almost $4,000 in revenue. So even though our fuel sales were down, that new price structure is definitely working, and we are not seeing a loss in revenue, even though early fuel sales are down. Part of that, truthfully, is just due to weather. We've had some really, really hard weather days at the airport, and we are doing everything that we can to keep that runway open and allow our traffic to come in and out. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, the runway length is the #1 reason why those jets are not coming into Warsaw. They just do not have, the second that that runway is contaminated, meaning there's any snow and ice, water, freezing rain, anything on the runway, they cannot come to Warsaw. The second reason that we have been told they have not been able to come in is that de-icing capability for the aircraft. And we are working very hard at trying to get that in place. There's just no way for us to do that right immediately for this current winter that we are in, but we will have it in place for the winter of 2019. So just by November, December of this year, we will have all of that in place.
Are we gonna have a specific place for the de-icing? Is
There are a few locations that have already, that is through IDEM, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. They tell us where we can and cannot spray. The product that we use is very environmentally friendly. The only thing we need to be careful of is that it doesn't get into a stormwater system because it has BOD inhibitors. That limits the amount of oxygen that gilled animals can absorb through the gills. So we have a few different locations at the airport where it sheet flows into the grass. Anywhere that product goes into the grass, it just acts like fertilizer. We'll have really green, thick grass in the spring. So as long as it doesn't get into a stream, a river, a lake, a waterway, we can spread it out, and it's just like putting fertilizer down. So we have identified 5 locations currently. Some of them are corporate hangars where the aircraft are, they pull them in and out of their private hangars, and then there is one location on the public ramp where we can de-ice as well.
Okay. questions about that? Anything further under manager's report?
Just the new business.
Okay, well, we're gonna go to new business right now then.
Okay.
The one thing I see noted, unless the board has something else, is the FAA land use audit. And apparently that was dealing with aeronautical versus non-aeronautical uses. That was their question. What do you know?
Correct. So, as you remember, we had the land use audit in 2017, and part of that was coming up with a program and a policy as an airport for our aeronautical use land versus non-aeronautical use. There are certain locations where some tenants have RVs parked. There's other locations where some tenants might have an external shed. They just wanted extra storage for whether it's aircraft parts or otherwise. And they are stating that even if the tenant has a land lease with the airport, everything outside of that hangar needs to have a lease tied to it. And if it is non-aeronautical use, the airport needs to charge a standard local rate for that land. So if normal storage, I'm using round numbers, I've done no research into this, but if local storage for a RV is $500 a year, then if the airport approves and says you can store an RV at the airport and the board decides that that is a direction you want to go, then we need to charge the standard local rate for that. The other part of it is that also counts for inside of hangars. Because those hangars are there for aeronautical use, they are there to store aircraft, they need to be used to store aircraft, and so the airport needs to have annual inspections to ensure that is actually being met.
So they're making us get in the enforcement game when it comes to
Correct.
that.
Yep.
And I would suspect we have a few that would,
Yep.
okay.
So-
What's our time frame for this?
We need to have a plan in place. It doesn't need to be done next week, but it definitely needs to be, we need to show that we are working towards correcting some of these issues. And I had Linda not send out the land leases at the end of January so that we could have this meeting tonight. I'm going to type a letter tonight, first thing to tomorrow morning, get Jay's eyes on it. We will send that to all of our tenants so that they know what is coming.
Yeah.
Give them just a brief rundown. And then my idea was, in the next week or so, meet with John and Dan, since we are already working on the land lease, have a meeting about all of that and try to put together some policies that we can bring to the board at the March meeting and invite our tenants also to come out and give their suggestions and ideas as well.
Okay.
Is this coming from the state or the Fed?
The feds.
That's it.
Part of our, and I understand it's not, it is what it is. The FAA's mandates airports to be as self-sustaining as possible. And if we can charge money for storage of vehicles or whatever it is, we are supposed to maintain aeronautical use only, and that's it. But if we have space that we can't use for aviation, we're going to chart and we can store something else there and make some money, they're okay with that, but we have to have a policy in place so that everybody is following the same rules.
Okay.
Okay.
So,
Very good.
outside of that, unless you guys have specific questions on that,
Anything else, any other new business to bring before the board?
Sure.
If not, our next currently scheduled meeting is March 12th, 2019, and meeting is adjourned.
You just made me.